I think Will covered it very well, Eagle, and the influences of it, because it just influenced everyone, whatever it was doing. I've made a few notes here which I thought because trying to remember all the things, how to condense everything, I did a few notes initially on Eagle and its influences and how, because I got involved in it. And then when we get past it, I'll be ad-libbing anyhow with throwing a few things at you. But I'll just read out some of the notes I've got here. Some of them Will's already covered, but I'm sure it won't hurt to go it again. Eagle was unique for many reasons, but the most important one was the way it was created and allowed to develop its own way. It was fortunate the Holton Press liked and took up the idea, because never having published children's paper before, they not only left the creative team in charge of it, but they gave it the funds of an adult paper. They had no idea that comics had less funds, so they gave it the same funds. So they, like Will said, Marcus and Frank, they had the money, they could go out and get the people they wanted, and, good artists, good writers, and experiment whichever way they liked. No other publisher would have ever handled it this way or got the same results. A regular uptake of 750,000 copies was sold every week, with an estimated readership of 2.25 million. Now they got to that from they were thinking brothers, sisters, mums and dads, school friends would all dive in and read it. I've had later proof from people writing into Spaceship Away telling me stories about how they came about it. This was not only achieved because of the stunning artwork. Eagle didn't talk down to kids. It used adult language, tackling big ideas and concepts. How things work, cutaways, sport, competitions, text stories, picture strips. You couldn't call it a comic, you'd call it a magazine. I mean, I've always thought of it as a magazine like that. Of course, the star of the show was Frank Hampson's Dan Dare, produced by a team of dedicated artists working absolutely crazy hours. They worked all night, as Greta would tell you. They worked all night through the night, and Frank would get something on there, and then he'd decide, I've got a better idea, and he'd rip that off and start again, or if he wasn't happy with it, he'd get it drawn again and again. And it, absolutely madness, really. But he was a perfectionist, and he was after that really special result at the end, which, of course, he ended up getting. Right, let's go on here. Right, one of the things I was going to show, as Will's already shown the outside of the bakehouse studio, that's a cutaway we did in the Spaceship Way of what was inside the bakehouse at the time. This kind of shared it with a stone floor and stuck a carpet down in old cupboards and things in there. No proper toilet facilities, nothing. And that's how they started producing for the first up until, I think, mid-19th, I'm not sure when they did move down, mid of 1950, somewhere in 1950?
Oh, August 1950.
August 1950 yes. When they actually moved south to other things. But that's how it all started.
6 or 9, I can't remember.
And, I think it was all coming out of this silly little thing. And because it had these light things over there, and they got the perfect lighting. That's why he picked the place to do it in. So, crazy what's going on. Where was I here? Frank of his profession, often redrawing frames. If you didn't, I've been through that. He scripted the very first Dan Dare story, which was full of inventive ideas, and he even tackled male prejudice against females head-on from episode 5. I mean, they thinking of this as a children's comic. Episode 5, they bring in Professor Peabody, and they say, oh, God, we can't take a woman to Venus, this is too dangerous and all the rest of it. Make a big splash of it in there. Sir Hubert gets overruled by the world government, take Peabody along, and of course she turns out to be brave, resourceful, doesn't lose her head in dodgy situations. And it does make a role. In fact, the first 3 stories of Dan Dare, Peabody has a very strong role. And it was discovered, when they did research after the Eagle had been going for a bit, they discovered that 20% of the readership of Eagle were girls. And this is what led to Holton saying, we better put out a paper for girl. The only disadvantage when they did that, Peabody's role in Eagle was downgraded. She became someone needing more assistance than giving it, and for 2.5 years she was written out the story altogether, which was a shame, because a lot of people were influenced by the early Peabody, who was used of brains and courage and everything to do different things. Right, I've covered that bit on there. The attraction of the strip was not only the fantastic artwork inventions, but it felt real. Dan and his crew weren't superhumans. They got tired, they got hungry, they made mistakes sometimes, and all the background science at the time was the science of the solar system as they believed it was then. Because unfortunately now they were totally wrong, but actually every story they based on is being turned upside down. But at the time it felt very real to us because they were still arguing about canals on Mars. Arthur C. Clarke, there was the references to, there's been different references about Arthur C. Clarke's involvement in Eagle and speculation over it over the years. Frank actually made 2 phone calls to Arthur C. Clarke. This is before they got going with the Venus story, to decide what planet they were going to occupy the story on. They decided Mars was kind of a dust bowl with not much there, but Venus under the clouds, it'd probably be lush, plenty of water, tropical jungles and everything. Oh, we could do a lot more with Venus, so that's why they went there. And that was his only involvement, really. He might have suggested that the race might be reptilian, I don't know. But Frank devised the rest of it and planned the story just on that basis. That's what Joan Porter's told me, that she was Frank Hampton's assistant for years, and she was trying to nail this because there's been so much speculation on what Arthur C. Clarke did or not did at the time. Let's see where we've done the girl bit there. Right, now let's get through that page. That's good. One down. Right, I'm coming to where I fit in all this. Now, I was 7-year-old when I first clamped Eyes on Eagle. I've been protected in comics up until then. My mother remarried, my stepfather and me didn't quite see eye to eye, and I got dumped into a boarding school. And they were all reading this fantastic comic, or magazine, magazine. I was immediately captured by the artwork, and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I couldn't understand all the dialogue in it, because this was more adult stuff, but then that didn't matter 2 hoots. This is big boy stuff, and little boys want to be big boys, so this is the type of thing where the little boys were just reading it. In fact, when they did bring Swift, well, Swift was out at the time. When I saw Officer Swift, that was too childish. I wanted Eagle. I didn't want the paper they brought out for my age group. The youngsters didn't want. They always and I think this is one of the reasons Eagle was so successful. It not only appealed to the age group it was aimed at, it appealed to the people younger than that, and because it didn't talk down to kids, the adults liked it as well. So this is why it had such a fantastic readership. Now let's see what I've there. Bang! I'm shot already. They got me. It more or less, I mean, Dan Dare stayed pretty solid right through the 50s, where Frank Hampton was in charge of the studio. There was continuity between stories, references to previous stories. Quite a lot of the stories were dated, and it all had a solid feel to it. And then when Frank left the strip, they brought Frank Bellamy on board to draw it. I think it's Frank actually picked Bellamy to draw Dan Dare because he was such a good artist on the other things he had done on Eagle. So Bellamy's got to be the one to take over. Unfortunately, Bellamy drew it in his own style, and Dan Dare quite often didn't look like Dan Dare. And a lot of us readers were getting a bit worried about that. And we did write in to Eagle. Now, it's very interesting, this. I've got 2 letters illustrated here because one has got a rubber stamp on the bottom where it's obviously just gone through the middle. Oh, another reader asking about this plunk. But the letter which I complained about what was going on, actually Clifford Makins, who was then the editor of Eagle, actually signed it in a proper pen. I might as well read you what they answer with this. Dear Roderick, gave me my full name in those days. Thank you for your letter about Dan Dare. The reason why Frank Hampton has stopped drawing this feature is simply because he asked for a rest from this most demanding job. Incidentally, he is returning to Eagle at his own request on the back page in a few weeks' time. I agree that Frank Bellamy's characters are different from the original ones created by Hampton, but Bellamy is a fine artist in his own right. It would be wrong for us to insist that he imitates another man's work. I do understand that this move has caused some distress with our older readers. I wonder how many wrote in, actually. It would be interesting. But I've given you the reasons in good faith and hope you will accept them. Yours sincerely. Now, it's very interesting. About 2 or 3 months, this is February 1960, that's when I came to that. When they got into, a few months later, they got Bellamy to change everything. They threw out all the old uniforms, spacecraft, they said it's totally changed stuff. And so they lost all the continuity that Frank had built up over, right through the 50s, which was appalled a lot of the readers, the Dan Dare readers at the time. Now, I continued taking Eagle to beginning of 1964, and with all takeovers and everything, things were disappearing out of it. Other strips disappeared. Dan Dare got pushed down to black and white, and I thought, oh well, this is it. Mind you, by 1964 I was getting more interested in pop music and girls, so I did tend to stop taking it then. But I always had an interest in the early stories. And by luck, in the same year, 1960, when it started to go down, and Bellamy had taken over and various other things, changes started happening down there, I managed from a lad at school, when he found out I was interested in Eagles, oh, I've got some early Eagles, because I was interested in getting these early ones. And he very kindly sold me his brother's first 152 copies, 102 copies of Eagle, which they were loose pages. I had some of the centre spreads, some of the PC49s, most of Dan Dare's continuous, right through to halfway through the Red Moon mystery. And that was, well, how's this blooming thing end? It really got me hooked. He was stuck on the Red Moon there, on this rope, dangling the rope. He got a Morse message, which turned out from Peabody, which I decoded, of course. And, Peabody, E-body, it's Peabody. And of course I couldn't find out how this ends. So I wrote into Eagle again saying, can I come up and see the files to see how this thing ends? And they said, oh, yes, you can. Yes, you're welcome to come up. They gave me the times I could come up and see it. Unfortunately, I was unable to do that, so I was still getting desperate. And it turns out about the end of the year, come September, let's have a look at the date on that, it was May when I wrote in asking that. It would have been October when I wrote in again saying, please, can someone tell me how this story ends? And my letters got passed on to the Dan Dare Studio. Eric Eden was writing the Dan Dare strip at the time, which was a member of the Dan Dare Studio and had been at the beginning. And he very kindly wrote back. I started bombarding him with letters then. Poor chap. Having written 2 long letters back to me about answering questions I had, the third letter I never had a reply from. I would imagine either he got fed up of hearing from me, or he might not have been scripting the paper. Because in the early days, Eagle would answer any letter through. You could write in, you get answers to anything. New Eagle, when I wrote to them later on, you write to them, you never hear a dicky bird back. They really took care of what readers thought, and you did really feel Eagle belonged to you. It was, it was part of your upbringing, and it just felt it was part of the family somehow. With all these different things happening in it, the other strips and things, you got your taste of science and how things worked and everything. As Will says, it inspired a whole generation of engineers, artists, people wanting to get into space. I was most disappointed when the Americans packed up after getting to the moon and decided they weren't going anywhere else. But it's all from that. So Dan Dare finished in 1969. There was... From 1970, I was still chasing it for 10 years. I was chasing about 30. I missed out one thing. You could also buy back issues of Eagle in those days. You could actually write into Eagle and buy back issues. So I first tried getting all of the missing back issues I wanted from them. They only had 3 from the first year. Progressive Rose, they had more and more. And I ended up with only 34 issues short of this early period. And then I spent the next 10 years trying to locate them, mainly through the Exchange and Mark, because there wasn't much you could do that. I followed adverts in there. And in 1970, Andrew Skilleter placed an advert in there for Eagle 1 and 2. It turned out when Eagle finished in 1969, David Frost had done a little bit on his TV programme, borrowed Andy's first 2 issues, and promptly lost them. So he offered Andy to pay what it was to replace them. But Andrew Skilleter only lived 30 miles away, and I saw the address. Wow, there's another fan just down the road. I had no idea that he was connected with the original Eagle Club, or in fact that he had a collection of original Eagle artwork. Anyway, I phoned him up and we went to meet there. He immediately put me in touch with 40 other fans. I thought, this is heaven. And I was writing to everyone, and I soon got the missing issues I wanted. And he showed me original artwork that he had, and it blew me away, because he had some pristine boards of Frank's there, which had been shielded from daylight, so they hadn't faded, and the colour just whacked you, and you go, wow. We always thought the Eagle looked good, but if you could see what the original artwork was, because the printing process in the 50s wasn't quite as good as it is today, and also there was fine detail on some of these pages, which again didn't survive the printing process. So that gave me a taste in artboards, which I ended up chasing as well, but that's kind of near there. The whole thing was, it put me in touch with other fans. The fans had gone through several, well, as you've seen through the presentation you just had, there was all different magazines and everything the fans put out, and they even did a big convention in 1980, which they brought all people of Eagle together for the Why Not Hotel in London. I had a chance to meet Frank there, which was fantastic. He is my hero. I finally managed to meet him, and I managed to corner him in a corridor or something for 10 minutes. And I thought, I can't remember any question I wanted. All the questions I've been waiting to ask him for years. And you stand there and you're mumbling away, well, the artwork was fantastic. You know, we really, everything had gone out of my head. I can't remember the thing. But I stayed on the fringe of the fan group right the way through until 1990, really. I took all the fanzines and subscribed to everything. Every time I thought of something I could write in to say it, someone else had done it. And then, by then, they brought out various other versions of Down There since, and as I say, with the new Eagle, as they touched on, brought out the great-great-grandson, and finally in 1989 they said, oh, we'll go back to the original one. And they pulled in Keith Watson to do a little short story, which he drew very much like old Down There. It got pretty, the drawing was brilliant for what he did for the pages he did of that. And we thought, oh great, it's back, it's fantastic, this is just what we want. Unfortunately, he only did a couple more stories there, and the stories just went downhill. And it wasn't long after they brought the original one back, they started messing with it again. Oh, we'll put new uniforms on, we'll change the spacecraft. They ended up with a silly spacecraft looking like an eagle. It bore no resemblance to the solidness of the 50s, where it felt real. You believed in the technology, even though gravity motors and all the rest, that was the bit of it. You really believed these things could happen. It felt real. What happened from that? Oh, yes, in 1990 there was Crisis came out. Revolver came out, which morphed into Crisis, and they brought out this very dark version of Down There, and it's a pensionable Down There, and it's a very dark political scene of Britain in a hell of a state, and he'd been tricked into supporting the party which was doing all this. And that was almost the last straw for a lot of fans, and what they started doing was commissioning Keith Watson to do individual artboards of Down There for them. And I heard about this, so I joined the queue. And just for luck, I was talking to another Down There fan, Dave Westaway. I said, oh, I'm joined the queue for one of Keith's boards. And he said, well, why don't you all join together and do a new story? And I thought, wow, this is a brilliant idea. When I got back home, I got on the phone to Keith. I said, look, if I can round up enough fans to do a whole new story, are you up for it? And he said yes, because it's something he'd advertised in the past. He always wanted to have the Down There studio, to do Down There the right way. The advantage with Keith was he was a fan first before he ever joined the Down There team. So he understood how fans felt and thought about Down There and the feeling for it. And that's what he wanted to get back to. He was annoyed with stories he'd had to do with Down There which didn't reflect the true Down There, all the equipment and everything else. So and his condition was doing it. It says, as long as I have editorial control, if there's anything I don't like in it, I can change it. I said, no problem with me. In fact, the more we talked on the phone, we talked over the next 6 months, we talked ever such a lot on the phone, and the more you realised that we were so in tune with the way we thought of presenting Down There. The idea that it should be brought back to the roots. We wanted Peabody with a stronger role in it. Lex, which had been brought in as a seafarer into down there. We thought, well, he didn't really fit in there. We'll send him back to sea. We had Flamer, who was an astral college, well, meant to be an astral college. He was forever flying around with Dan there. He never went to college, so we parked him back in college. That was how we were thinking on this. For the 6 months, we had no one else come up with any stories. One, Simon Garrett had sent in a few, which were spin-offs from Dan Dare. But as Dan Dare wasn't in them, we were kind of stuck. So I thought, well, we've gone 6 months with this great idea. Lots of fans think it's a good idea, but we're not getting anywhere. I'll have to have a go at writing the story. So I'd got the tiger by the tail. I had no idea what it was going to drag me into this. So I started writing. I wrote a brief story which got modified umpteen times. I think the first episode got written 35 times in the end. Refining it, I bounced it off other fans, which they very kindly kind of suggested ideas. Sometimes there would just be a one-word idea, slip this word in here or take that word out. But if you take a dozen, or well, more than a dozen, about 2 dozen ideas in, when you take all those little ideas together, it all made it stronger. Eventually, we actually got Joan Porter in to read the scripts, because I've heard somewhere that she used to check Alan Shanks' scripts on Dan Dare to check that Digby's speech was right. And so I thought, well, this is a great idea. We'll ask Joan to read through, and she can correct any of my Digby speech to make sure it's authentic. She also found 1 or 2 things at Dan Dare she didn't think was right as well. But brilliant, anything which made things stronger. Now, I wanted a fully fledged Dan Dare saga, like the old days. Oh, great. I mean, the first stories ran well over, well, the first story was a year and a half. Most stories ran for a good year. But Keith said, oh, God, you're not going to get enough fans to sponsor this. He said, oh, we'll go for an Eagle annual size story, which is only 8 pages. Oh, that's too short, 8 pages. Well, let's try one for 8 episodes, which became 9 episodes by the time we had the first drafts in a reasonable state. It did end up being pushed on to 10. And we got to launch this. We thought a good time to launch this would be at one of the Eagle Society's dinners, which the following year, in 1992, was at Epsom, because it was celebrating Dan Dare. So we launched this there. Now, when I was there, I stood up in front of everyone and said, we're going to do this fantastic new story, like this. And this is what I was showing them. just a page with a few empty boxes and speech balloons on. And I said, we're going to do this fantastic new Dan Dare. I thought they must have thought I was nuts. I did actually have also a reference page, because it's going to be set in the Scatosphere space. I had done a kind of plan of what ships were there and where they were located as well. And that was all I was waving around. It was Keith which actually sold it to him. He came in after me, he stood up after me and said, we're going to do this the old way. We're going to do visuals of the new equipment. We're going to do roughs. And he said, anyone who sponsors the board, we could feature them as some of the new crew members in this story. And people kind of sat up and he was going on, he was going to do this and have and said, wow, this is really going to be good. In fact, thanks to Keith, half of the pages of the new story were already, people signed up for that before we even left that original meeting. I thought, wow, this is great, we're on a roll here. Then it was a year, because he had other commitments, he couldn't do anything to the following year. And what he did then, he did one of the first visuals. Now, unfortunately, I've only got a small version of it here, so that's hard to see there. But one of the new spaceships in the story, Marco Polo, he did this visual, the flight deck and what the outside colours would be. He came up with the idea of where the airlocks were. He put a yellow line around them so they would stand out. If you're away from the ship in space, you would see where the airlocks were and everything. And this was an A2 size board originally. And as soon as I showed this the following month to the next Eagle Society dinner, we had the rest of the boards all signed up. And they said, wow, this is going to be good. That and the fact that we also waved at them a commission he'd done for one of the other fans. I've only got, I haven't actually, the only picture I've got of it is in one of the Spatial Wave magazines. He did a commission for Roger Coombs of the Meakin. Now, all Roger asked him to do was the Meakin. And he ended up getting McConter as well and all kinds of other things in there. And I looked a bit younger there. That was me and Keith actually announcing this and even me waving these silly boards around. So when people saw these other things, they signed up for it, but it was over a year before he could do this. It took him 3 weeks to do that one. And then we went on to He did a rough of the first board, and he said he'd read through the first round 50 times. He always said he always wanted to do this job, to be the down there thing. Then when he got it, he said he began to realise the weight of all the fans and everything sitting on his shoulder, and he got really worried. I've got the final version now. I'll wave that around in there. But now he did the visual, and which he did in watercolour, and it was slightly. Again, I've got it in this magazine, which you can see. Hang on, I'll just put that down. There it is. And seeing actually the boards without any red boxes or artwork, lines or speech on them, they look quite bad. That was the original one that he did in watercolour. Then he did the same one, he did it again in airbrush and ink. The only difference was, comparing the two, Dandy looked a little bit sinister in that one. So when I put up the final one, we kind of pinched the head from the other one, lettered it all up and everything. That was his very first page, which came out there. Unfortunately, that was Keith Watson's final ever artwork. A week after he had completed this and passed it on to me, he hadn't been feeling right, and went to the doctors, and it turned out that he had cancer, and by the following year he had died. When they tried operating, they found it was too far spread, and he became a recluse, and he didn't have contact with anyone. He shut himself away, and it was very sad the following year too. And we also lost one of our other contributors to the story. Also died within 9 days of Keith. When we went along to Keith's funeral, and we were talking with his wife and children afterwards, and we have one of the original artworks on the table like this, and I said, well, this was Keith's final ever artwork, and it meant a lot to him, because he insisted that it was Frank Hampton was credited, because that was the creator, which we all believed in. And I gave them the promise then. I said, well, somehow I'll get this project finished and published, because that is Keith's final artwork. So that's what kind of was driving me from that point. Something else, just this one passing, which I missed out on one of my early notes when I was talking about the Standair studio. They had even models in there made, and that's the model they had of Spaceship. This is the original picture of the model of Spaceship, and that's the plan of the model, which it's got actually Joan Porter's notes on there, because that was sent on to Waldup, one of the later artists, so he had references. The reason I'll come to that later on, because we kind of updated, we had another fan updated these plans, which we used for our story later on. We were stuck then for an artist to take over, and we wanted original artists, and we approached Don Harley. Now, what was rather ironical of this, Don and Greta had been in the audience when we had originally launched this, and he had said, thank goodness I'm not doing that, when he saw what we'd letting ourselves in for, because he ends up having to do the rest of it. The only problem with it was that he had lots of other work on. He said, I can only fit in pages in between my other jobs. Originally we thought it would take 18 months to do the short story, as it was then. It did take 8 years to complete from the beginning to end. A few pages. In the worst year we had 3 pages of it. The best year we had 7. So it took a while to do that. But looking at it now, one advantage was that we had plenty of time in between those episodes to refine the script, improve things. A lot of thought. I realised you don't realise he's trying to do this, that you need to work out the small details, stuff that people never see, because you can trip yourself up later on. Some of this stuff. So on 2 of the new spacecraft, like the Marco Polo and the Delaware, and I'll get this bit of paper out of here, ended up doing whole deck plans of the ship where everything was, so you knew how long it would take to get from anywhere to anywhere else. I couldn't find my colour version of this, because normally this would have been coloured, so you could the way up to see that. But everything worked out. We soon found out originally the crew I had manning this wasn't big enough, so we had to double the crew numbers because there were too many people on duty and off duty and things like that. So it's only by working out the details that you find out what is important. We had to work out a history of the ship, where it came from, what it was originally designed for, what it had been modified for the mission we had. So you've got an authentic background. It all linked together. What I did when Don came to do any particular section, I would then do these other more detailed frames of the particular area he was working in with notes attached, so he could see exactly what was what and what episodes different things would be in. And so that's the kind of notes and things which went into that. One of the other ships which we developed for the story, we finished the use of the story, we didn't need to work out, well, I worked out roughly what the whole ship would be like, the Delaware, but 3 of the main decks which were used in the story, again, I did full details out of what would be what you would see and everything else. Don didn't always follow what was on the page, unfortunately, but still, this comes to another thing which I can see the advantage Frank had with his first story, as he was the creator of the strip as well. He knew exactly what he wanted and could follow his vision exactly. When you're the writer and you're supplying the artist with the stuff that you want them to draw, they don't always see it the same way as you do. How it would happen is I would send the script to Don. He would do a rough of the page. I can show you some roughs of some later pages in there. And the end result of some of the other stories I did. He would send back sometimes detailed roughs, sometimes a bit sketchy. You would then comment on the roughs, and he would correct whatever it is you weren't happy with, and then start on the final page. I might as well show you the finished version of that. That is original artwork from Don of that particular page. I don't think there's many changes to that one. Some pages there's more changes to than others. So we've got that one there. Let's see when we flip it over. Yeah, it's more or less the same. That's the details and everything there. Sorry, if you can't see over that side. Everyone can have a look later on with it. But one problem I found. Oh, sorry, whizzing on two. I could go on for hours on that. When artists get involved, you do the rough, you approve the rough, you then do the final job, and then you're talking about how's it coming? Oh, it's coming on fine. Oh, I thought it was a better idea for frame 3, and you think, oh. You'd think of a different angle or something, look at it, or something else. Now, sometimes what would come back would be a lot better. Think, wow, that's great. Occasionally, something would come back, and he lost the point of why he did the frame like it the first time. That there was I tried to do what Frank did. He often put stuff in the background, which an observant reader would pick up on the little sub-stories going on in the background, and they would slowly follow it through frame by frame, different things happening. And a couple of times, Don had changed the view angle so you couldn't see what was happening in the background. He'd have to zoom in on the character so he didn't have to draw the background and things like that. So that you lost some of these things that you really wanted. And at first I didn't have the confidence to challenge him on some of this. But still, I've only got a few minutes. This is like I've gone forever with it. I've got various bits and pieces here. Anyone's welcome to look through. We eventually, Don, when we got going, Spaceship Away came about because we got the first story finished. We had nowhere to put it. While it was being written, we had lots of people approach us. Hawk Books wanted to use it because it fitted between Down Dare stories. They wanted to use it to put in one of their books, but it wasn't finished. We had BBC Publications who'd had Tomorrow's World magazine out there. They wanted to use Down Dare, but again, we could never keep up with a monthly thing. Newspaper The Planet on Sunday came out. They wanted to do Down Dare. Again, they approached us. But we said we'd never keep up with a weekly thing. It's taking us months to get. It would take Don about a month to do a board. And because there's so much going into it, so we missed out. We passed that one to Sydney Jordan, on Sunday, which unfortunately didn't survive past the first episode. But eventually, when we'd got this ready, nothing was happening on Down There because the people who then owned the copyright were bringing out a CGI series in a couple of years' time. So they wouldn't let anyone do anything with old Down There because they wanted their thing to be the big thing. And it came, CGI series, it came, it went, it didn't turn into the big thing they expected. So suddenly they started letting licenses out for the old Down There. And I thought, well, we'll find you can do something with this. We applied for a license, can we publish this in Spaceship magazine? And we managed it. It took 3 months before we got a reply from them, but in the end we did get a license, and then we started doing a fanzine for Down There, concentrating on the original Down There with our new stories and write-ups. And it just grew from a small little thing, bigger and bigger, as other fans jumped on board and telling us the things that people were building models and painting pictures and doing other stories. So it just, we suddenly had somewhere to go with this stuff. And so they piled on board, and we ended up with a 44-page magazine. I've brought some examples with me if anyone wants to look through if they haven't seen them, to see what we were doing. And we even had a cutaway. We started doing cutaways just like Eagle. And because of the Spaceship, where we'd had the plans drawn up, we had a cutaway done of it in there again, so that people who were reading the story could follow what was happening on the ship. Not all of these have got Graham Bleetham cutaways in. And yes, that's Bayford Lodge, the second Down There studio. We did cutaway and everything of that, explaining how it all worked. We didn't, because we weren't on the internet at the time, and it was only through fans who knew about us, and we were only very few shops. We ended up we thought, well, let's bring in other fan groups. And we thought, well, how about Journey into Space? Because again, it's a 50s thing, which we liked. And we chased that down. Very like Charles Chilton had no objection to us doing it. We had fun trying to get permission from the BBC and what have you. But eventually we got it, and we started publishing from what was done in the Express in the 50s. We got permission to reprint the Journey into Space stories they did. Which are still going on in Spaceship Away at the moment, and because we had to pay copyright to the BBC for some photographs and do a little write-up on it, and then we moved into Hellstar, which we wanted to get Jeff Hawke. The idea was we suddenly thought, let's get all the main things from the 50s. We wanted to get Quatermass in there, but the estate, in fact, artist and writer did do a new Quatermass strip and did some sample pages, but that got ruled out by the estate as a writer, so no, we don't want anyone handling that. We couldn't get permission for Jeff Hawke in there, but what Sidney Jordan supplied us was with Hellstar, which he'd done for a Dutch publication, never been published in this country. So we got that, and we got John Ridgway coloured it up for us. So we ended up doing that, and we've gone on to do Garth and various other things. I've run out of time now. I'll go on forever. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. One or two questions. Are there a couple of questions to ask here? Yes, I thought there'd be one. Just a quick one.
A few years ago, I visited the Science Museum, and they had what purported to be the original artworks in a case as part of a very large display on sort of 50s technology. Where did that artwork come from?
They brought some Christie's, was it Christie's, David? Christie's sold quite a bit of original artwork up at one stage, and the Science Museum was a bidder there, and they brought some of the original artwork from there.
Mm-hmm. They were interested in particular boards that showed either technology or alien cities.
Yes,
That's the ones they targeted.
There were two boards done by Frank.
Yes, murals. They were full-size wall murals. They were floor to ceiling on boards. In fact, when he originally painted them on the wall, he went over. When you see pictures of them, feature them on the Spaceship Aways. It's actually his paint's gone over the edge where he's got enthusiastic. They were used in the Science Museum. They were taken down. They have been displayed occasionally since. Slightly knocked around in fact. They turned up at Southport, didn't they, for the
They're also there
1990.
for Down There and the birth of high-tech Britain.
Oh right, yeah. So they brought them back to Zambia because beautiful murals he did there.
One last question. No? Oh, okay.
Thank you. Just a quick one. Have you been able to gather any evidence? I mean, I presume you get feedback from the readership of Spaceship Away. Has this inspired or introduced Down There the original Dan Dare, as it were, to an entirely new generation of youngsters, or is it?
3/4 of our readership are original readers.
Right.
And we had them in 14 countries at one stage. Unfortunately, with the overseas postage rates going something crazy now, that has dropped back. The other quarter of the readership are often sons of the people who originally read Eagle, who got into it from their father's collections, or through the reprints, or through later versions of Dan Dare, having discovered the name, and then they've kind of backtracked and got interested in it. Okay. And we have found girls, we've had girl subscribers. In fact, I used to ring up subscribers when they supplied their phone number to find out the backgrounds. And I found one lady up, I suppose you're subscribing for your husband. Oh no, it's for me. And what she told me was, she said, well, I used to take Girl, my brother used to take Eagle, but Eagle was much better, she said. So she was still into Dan Dare, and she subscribed for herself, which that shut me up really in that perspective. But we had several ladies have subscribed for their own interest from it, which kind of followed the original thing that Dan Dare did appeal to the girls as well in the early days.
Well, thank you very much. That was excellent. We better move some of this to one side.